millionaire husband abandoned and humiliated his pregnant wife. "Get out of my life, you cursed woman." 7 years later, she returns and brings him to his knees. The chandelier above the grand dining hall shimmered with an opulent glow, casting golden light over the elegantly dressed guests. The scent of aged wine and gourmet dishes lingered in the air, mingling with the quiet hum of conversations. This was Robert Valens's world, a world of power, wealth, and status. Seated at the head of the long mahogany table, Robert wore his authority like a second skin. His tailored suit was flawless, his presence commanding. Around him, business tycoons and influential elites laughed at his jokes. Eager to remain in his good graces, beside him sat Natalie, his wife, unlike the others. She was silent, her hands nervously folded in her lap. She had never belonged in this world, and tonight, more than ever, she felt the weight of that truth pressing down on her chest. But she had something to say, something that would change their lives forever. She took a shaky breath, glancing at Robert. This wasn't the right time, she knew that. But when would it ever be? "Robert," she whispered, her voice barely reaching him over the noise. He didn't look at her immediately, too engrossed in a discussion about a billion-dollar merger. She tried again. "Robert?" With a sigh of impatience, he flicked his gaze toward her. "What?" Her fingers clenched under the table. "I need to tell you something important." Robert barely restrained an eye roll. "Can it wait?" "No, it can't." His jaw tensed, but he leaned slightly toward her. "Fine. What is it?" Natalie swallowed, summoning courage. "I'm pregnant." For a moment, time stood still. The words hung between them, heavier than the chandeliers above. The fork in Robert's hand clattered against his plate, drawing the attention of those nearby. His expression was unreadable, his grip tightening around his glass of wine. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he let out a low chuckle. A slow, humorless laugh. "You're joking," he muttered, shaking his head. She felt her pulse quicken. "Robert, I'm serious. We're going to have a baby." His smirk faded, replaced by something much colder. "Ladies and gentlemen," Robert suddenly announced, his voice rising over the hum of conversation, "it seems my dear wife has some news." The room quieted. All eyes turned toward them. Natalie stiffened. "Robert, please." He ignored her. "She's pregnant." Gasps, murmurs, and a few scattered congratulations filled the air. But Robert wasn't finished. He turned back to Natalie, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Tell me, did you really think this was part of the plan? That I'd be thrilled about being tied down with a child?" Her stomach twisted painfully. "I thought you'd..." "You thought what, Natalie? That this would make me happy?" He scoffed. "Let's be clear, you and this baby are nothing but a liability to me." A stunned silence fell over the guests. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others watched with thinly veiled amusement. Natalie felt the heat of humiliation creeping up her neck. "Please, not here. Let's talk in private." "Oh no, my dear," Robert sneered, raising his glass. "If you want to make announcements at my dinner table, let's make it official." To Natalie, for making the worst decision of her life, the wine glass in her hand slipped, shattering against the table. The sound echoed through the room. "You're humiliating me," she whispered, voice trembling. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze merciless. "You humiliated yourself the moment you thought you could trap me with a baby." Something inside her cracked. The room spun, whispers surrounding her like a suffocating cloud. She pushed back her chair and stood, legs unsteady. The realization hit her with a brutal finality. This man, the man she had loved, was incapable of love in return. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. If she cried now, he would win. With one last look at the stranger sitting beside her, she turned on her heels and walked out. No one stopped her, no one called her back, and Robert, still basking in his self-righteous arrogance, didn't spare her a second glance. Outside, the cool night air bit at her skin as she stepped onto the cobblestone driveway. The mansion loomed behind her, its grand doors closing her out of a life that had never truly been hers. She had nothing. No money, no belongings, nowhere to go. Natalie's heart pounded as she walked aimlessly, her heels clicking against the pavement. The city lights flickered in the distance, an unfamiliar world stretching before her. She reached into her clutch, searching for her phone, only to realize it was still inside the mansion. Panic settled in her chest. Where could she go? She had no family nearby, no friends who would take her in. But then, as her fingers hesitantly brushed over her stomach, something inside her shifted. She pressed a trembling hand against her belly, feeling the faintest flutter of life growing within her. She wasn't alone. A slow, deep breath filled her lungs. She had spent years standing in Robert's shadow, waiting for him to love her, waiting for him to see her. But tonight, she was done waiting. She may have nothing now, but she would not be broken. She would find a way to survive for herself and for the child who had just become her reason to fight. Squaring her shoulders, she turned toward the city and walked away from the mansion for the last time. The city lights blurred into a haze as Natalie walked, her heels clicking against the cold pavement. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to keep moving. The night air was sharp, biting against her exposed skin, but she barely felt it. Her mind was spinning, replaying the scene at the dinner table over and over again. The laughter, the humiliation, Robert's cold, merciless gaze. She had left everything behind. Her home, her clothes, her money. Everything she had built with him was no longer hers. But as she wrapped her arms protectively around her stomach, she reminded herself of the only thing that mattered now. She was carrying a life inside her, a baby that had no fault in this. She had to be strong, not just for herself, but for the child growing within her. The reality of her situation sank in quickly. She had no plan, no money, and nowhere to go. The city was ruthless to those without status, and without Robert's name, she was nothing here. She spotted a small bench near the bus station and sat down, her body trembling from exhaustion and shock. She needed to think. There had to be something she could do. Minutes turned into an hour, and the streets grew quieter. A few taxis passed by, their headlights illuminating her tear-streaked face for brief moments before vanishing into the distance. She considered calling someone, but who? She had distanced herself from old friends when she married Robert, and her family had never approved of her relationship with him in the first place. If she reached out now, would they even help her? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. She tensed, clutching her purse instinctively. A man in a hooded sweatshirt walked past her without a second glance, but the reminder of how vulnerable she was sent a new wave of panic through her. She couldn't stay out here all night. Summoning what little courage she had left, she stood and started walking again, scanning the streets for something, anything, that might provide her with shelter. That was when she saw the sign, Lillian's Inn, affordable lodging. It wasn't much, a rundown little motel with flickering neon lights, but it was a place to rest. She hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The scent of stale coffee and cleaning products hit her immediately. Behind the counter sat an older woman, her graying hair tied back in a loose bun as she flipped through a magazine. She looked up when she heard the door chime. "Can I help you, dear?" Her voice was kind but wary, as if she had seen her fair share of troubled people walk through those doors. Natalie cleared her throat, trying to steady her voice. I need a room for the night, just one night." The woman studied her for a moment before glancing at the clock. "It's late. We usually take payment up front." Natalie's heart sank. She reached for her purse, already knowing what she'd find. Nothing. Robert had ensured she left with only the dress on her back. I don't have money with me right now," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I can get it. I just need a place to stay tonight." The woman sighed, setting down her magazine. "You in trouble?" Natalie hesitated, then nodded for a long moment. The woman said nothing. Then, finally, she pushed a small key across the counter. "Room 7, down the hall. Pay me when you can." Tears welled in Natalie's eyes as she took the key. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't mention it." Natalie walked down the dimly lit hallway. Unlocking the door to her room, it was small, with a twin bed and a creaky nightstand, but it was warm and safe. The moment she shut the door behind her, she collapsed onto the mattress, her body shaking with silent sobs. The weight of everything crashed over her, suffocating and unbearable. She had nothing. She was alone, but she was still breathing, and as long as she was breathing, she had a chance. The next morning, Natalie woke to the soft light filtering through the worn-out curtains. Her body ached from exhaustion, but her mind was sharper than before. She couldn't afford to dwell on her pain. She needed a plan. After a quick wash in the tiny bathroom, she headed back to the lobby. The woman from the night before was still there, this time sipping coffee and watching an old television set. She looked up when Natalie approached. "You look like you got some fight left in you," she remarked. Taking another sip, Natalie forced a small smile. "I have to." The woman nodded. "Name's Lillian. And you?" "Natalie." "Well, Natalie, I don't usually do charity, but something tells me you ain't just another lost soul passing through." Natalie hesitated. I need work. I can clean. Organize. Whatever you need. I just need to earn enough to get back on my feet." Lillian studied her, then let out a low chuckle. "You ever cleaned motel rooms before?" "No," Natalie admitted. "Well, there's a first time for everything." And just like that, she had her first job. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't anything like the life she had before, but it was something that day. She scrubbed floors, changed linens, and did laundry until her arms ached. But as she worked, something remarkable happened. She felt lighter. She wasn't trapped in a cold mansion, living under Robert's cruel gaze. She wasn't surrounded by people who saw her as an accessory. She was free. That night, as she lay in bed, exhaustion pulling her toward sleep, she placed her hand on her stomach once more. "We're going to be okay," she whispered, because for the first time in years, she truly believed it. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Robert Valens' penthouse, casting long shadows over the modern minimalist furniture. The once pristine glass table in front of him was now littered with documents, reports, and empty whiskey glasses. His head throbbed from the hangover of the previous night's excesses, but the pounding in his skull was nothing compared to the storm brewing outside his door. A sharp knock echoed through the vast living room. He ignored it, staring blankly at the skyline. Another knock, more insistent this time. "Mr. Valens," came a voice from the other side. It was his assistant, Gregory. "You need to see this." Robert groaned, rubbing his temples. "Not now, Gregory. I think you'll want to see this." There was something in his tone, urgency laced with barely concealed panic. Robert sighed, dragging himself off the couch and opening the door. Gregory stepped inside, clutching a tablet, his usual composure faltering. Without a word, he handed it to Robert. Robert's eyes scanned the screen. The headline alone sent ice through his veins. "Valens Corporation on the brink. Internal fraud allegations surface." The article detailed rumors of financial misconduct within his company, leaked emails suggesting embezzlement, and anonymous sources claiming years of unethical practices. His jaw clenched as he scrolled further, recognizing names, former business associates, competitors, people who had once sat across from him at lavish dinners, smiling as they plotted their next moves. "This is bullshit," Robert muttered, tossing the tablet onto the couch. "Someone's trying to bury me." Gregory hesitated before speaking. "Sir, it's not just the media. Investors are pulling out. The board is in crisis mode. They're calling an emergency meeting this afternoon." Robert exhaled sharply, running a hand through his disheveled hair. He had built Valens Corporation from the ground up. He had made ruthless decisions, cut ties, crushed competitors, all in the name of success, and now everything was slipping through his fingers. "Get me a call with the board," he said, voice tight. "They're already meeting without you." That made Robert pause. His heart pounded against his ribs, the implications sinking in. They were shutting him out. "No," he said, shaking his head. "No, they wouldn't dare." But as he looked at Gregory, his most loyal assistant, now hesitant to meet his gaze, he realized the truth. They would, by noon. Robert was pacing inside the boardroom, surrounded by men and women who had once treated him as their king. Now their expressions were cold, calculating. "We need to talk," began Harrison, a senior board member, adjusting his glasses. "The situation has escalated beyond control." Robert straightened. "You're acting like we're already sinking. This is just a smear campaign. We've survived worse." A woman at the table, Evelyn Monroe, cleared her throat. "Robert, let's not pretend. The numbers don't lie. We've lost half of our major investors in the past 24 hours. Stocks are plummeting. The SEC is looking into irregularities in the last quarter's financial statements." Robert scoffed. "Are you accusing me of something, Evelyn?" "We're stating facts," she replied coolly. "And the fact is, the company won't survive this unless we take immediate action." A chill settled over Robert's skin. "What kind of action?" Harrison leaned forward. "We're voting to remove you as CEO." The words struck like a blow to the gut. Robert felt the air shift, the weight of the betrayal pressing down on him. He looked around the table, searching for a friendly face, but there were none. "You can't do this," he growled. "We already did," Harrison said, sliding a document across the table. "It's done, Robert," his fingers curled into fists. "After everything I've done for this company." "You did this to yourself," Evelyn cut in. "Years of ruthless decisions, of pushing away allies, of thinking you were untouchable. Well, guess what? You're not." Robert clenched his jaw so tightly he thought his teeth might break. Harrison sighed. "The best thing you can do now is step back gracefully. If you fight this, it'll only get uglier." Robert wanted to fight. He wanted to throw the table across the room, to remind them all who had built this empire. But deep down, he knew they had planned this for a long time, and he had given them every reason to want him gone. Without another word, he pushed back his chair and walked out. By the time he reached his penthouse, his phone was already flooded with missed calls. News anchors dissected his downfall on television screens. Financial analysts speculated on his next move. Once, he had been the one pulling the strings. Now, he was the puppet whose strings had been cut. He poured himself a drink, but it tasted bitter. His empire was crumbling. His fortune was slipping away. And for the first time in years, he was completely, utterly alone. And yet, amidst the chaos, one thought gnawed at him, more painful than the rest. Natalie, for years, she had been by his side, offering him something real, something he had dismissed as weakness. He had thrown her away, humiliated her, and now she was gone, building a life he would never be a part of. Regret settled heavily in his chest, but it was too late. Or was it? The thought was dangerous, desperate, but as Robert stared at his reflection in the glass window, watching the city that had once belonged to him, a flicker of something unfamiliar sparked inside him for the first time in his life. He wondered what it would be like to have nothing, and to have to start over. Natalie wiped the sweat from her forehead as she finished making the last bed in one of the motel rooms. The afternoon sun streamed through the dusty curtains, casting a warm glow over the small but clean space. Her muscles ached, and her hands were raw from scrubbing floors. But for the first time in years, she felt a sense of control over her life. She wasn't living in luxury anymore, but at least she wasn't trapped in a world where she was invisible. Lillian had given her a chance, and she wasn't going to waste it. The job wasn't glamorous. Cleaning rooms, washing sheets, and occasionally dealing with unpleasant guests. But it was honest work. She was earning her way, step by step, and that meant something. As she locked up the room and returned to the front desk, Lillian glanced up from her newspaper. "You're catching on quick," she remarked. "Most people don't last their first week." Natalie offered a small smile. "I don't have a choice." Lillian studied her for a moment before setting down her coffee. "I've seen a lot of people come through here, running from something. You don't strike me as someone who's just passing through." Natalie hesitated. "I don't have anywhere else to go." Lillian nodded as if she already knew. "Then maybe it's time you start thinking about what's next." That thought stayed with Natalie for the rest of the evening. What was next? She had spent so much of her life trying to fit into Robert's world that she had forgotten what it felt like to dream for herself. But now, with nothing left to lose, she had an opportunity to rebuild. The question was, how? Later that night, after finishing her shift, she sat on the edge of her bed and opened the worn notebook she had picked up from a convenience store earlier that day. She needed a plan. The first thing she wrote, "What am I good at?" The second, "What do I want?" The answers didn't come easily. She had spent years being defined by her role as Robert's wife, a silent figure in his shadow. But as she thought back, memories started resurfacing. Memories of the things that had once made her feel alive. She had always loved problem solving, organizing and understanding how things worked. She had a mind for business. Even if Robert had never taken her seriously, she had seen his deals, read his reports, listened to the way companies thrived and collapsed. And she had ideas she had never dared voice. The realization sent a thrill through her. She had spent so much time believing she was powerless, but that wasn't true. She had knowledge, she had drive, and now she had nothing to hold her back. The next morning, she found herself at the local library, poring over business books, financial guides, and anything she could get her hands on. She didn't have the resources Robert had, but she had something more valuable: determination. Days turned into weeks. Between shifts at the motel, she studied. She learned about startups, about technology, about the changing landscape of the business world. She discovered an online community of entrepreneurs and started engaging with them, absorbing every lesson she could. One evening, while on break at the motel, she overheard a conversation between two guests, tech developers discussing a new app they were struggling to market. A spark ignited inside her. "What's the problem?" she asked before she could stop herself. The two men looked at her. Surprised, one of them, a man in his early 30s with glasses, raised an eyebrow. "Why do you ask?" Natalie hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "Because I might be able to help." They exchanged glances before shrugging. "All right, our app is good, but we can't seem to get it in front of the right audience. We don't have the connections or the marketing experience." Natalie's mind raced. She had seen this happen before. Brilliant ideas that never reached their potential because they lacked the right strategy, and strategy was something she understood. "Give me a week," she said. "Let me take a look at what you have, and I'll come up with a plan." They hesitated, but something in her confidence made them nod. "All right, we'll send you the details." As they left, Natalie felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Excitement that night. She worked tirelessly, analyzing their app, researching their target audience, and crafting a strategy. She didn't have the prestige of a corporate firm backing her, but she had insight, and she knew how to make an impact. A week later, she presented her findings to the two men. They were impressed. "You really know your stuff," one of them admitted. "I do," she replied. "Would you consider working with us?" The offer was unexpected but exhilarating. It wasn't just about the money. It was the opportunity to prove herself, to take a step into something bigger. And so, just like that, Natalie had her first consulting job. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Over the next few months, her name began circulating among small startups and independent developers. People sought her out for advice, for guidance, for a fresh perspective. She built a reputation, not as Robert Valens' ex-wife, but as someone who understood the market and how to navigate it. Her confidence grew with every success. She moved out of the motel and into a modest apartment. She registered her own business, and she thrived. By the time she hit her first six-figure contract, she knew she was never going back to the life she once had. She had built something for herself, something no one could take away, and for the first time in a long, long time, she was happy. The city skyline stretched before Natalie as she sat on the balcony of her new apartment, sipping a cup of tea. It was nothing like the penthouse she had once shared with Robert, but it was hers, a place she had earned with her own hard work. The air smelled of rain, and the distant hum of traffic reminded her of how far she had come in just a few years. Her consulting business had taken off faster than she had expected. What had started as a single project had snowballed into a thriving network of clients, entrepreneurs, tech startups, and small businesses all sought her expertise. She wasn't just surviving, she was thriving, and yet, despite everything she had built, a part of her still felt unsettled. She set down her cup and glanced at her laptop screen, where an email notification blinked. It was from an investor interested in working with her, someone with deep pockets who could elevate her company to the next level. She should have been thrilled instead. Her stomach twisted into knots, because the name on the email was familiar. Harrison and Monroe Investments. Natalie inhaled sharply, her mind reeling. She had sat across from those very same board members years ago when they had turned on Robert, stripping him of everything he had built. They were the ones who had orchestrated his downfall. And now, they wanted to work with her. She wasn't naive. She knew how ruthless the business world could be. These people didn't care about loyalty or ethics. They only cared about power. And somehow, she had entered their radar. She closed the laptop and rubbed her temples. Did she want this? Did she want to climb higher into the same world that had once crushed her? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. She stood and opened it to find Walter, the man who had believed in her when no one else had. He had aged a little over the years, silver strands more prominent in his dark hair, but his sharp eyes still held the same warmth they always had. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said with a small smile. Natalie stepped aside to let him in. "Of course not. You know you're always welcome." He sat down on the couch, glancing at her laptop. "You look like you've seen a ghost." She sighed. sinking into the chair across from him. Not a ghost. Just a reminder of how small this world really is. Walter raised an eyebrow. Let me guess, someone from the past wants to do business with you. Natalie nodded, handing him her laptop. He scanned the email and let out a low whistle. Harrison and Monroe, that's big and dangerous. I know, she murmured. That's the problem. Walter leaned back. You've worked hard to get where you are. You don't need them. But I know you, Natalie. You don't just turn down opportunities. She hesitated. It's not just business, Walter. It's personal. He studied her for a long moment before nodding. Then maybe the real question isn't whether or not you should work with them. Maybe the question is, are you ready to face what you left behind? His words hung in the air long after he was gone. That night, Natalie lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Was she ready? She had spent years moving forward, creating a new life, but she had never truly faced what she had left behind. She had never confronted the past, never confronted him, Robert. The thought of him sent a strange mix of emotions coursing through her. She had once loved him, given him everything, only to be tossed aside like she was nothing. But where was he now? She hadn't heard anything about him in years, the last she knew. He had lost everything, and part of her hoped he had changed. The next morning, she made her decision. She replied to the email, setting up a meeting with Harrison and Monroe. If they wanted to work with her, they would do it on her terms. She would no longer be the woman who had been discarded. She was the one holding the power now. Natalie adjusted the cuffs of her blazer as she stepped out of the black sedan in front of the towering glass building of Harrison and Monroe Investments. The air was crisp, the scent of rain lingering in the streets, a reminder of the many nights she had spent walking through this very city, lost and broken. But she was no longer that woman. Today, she was stepping into this meeting as someone powerful, someone with control over her own destiny. The moment she entered the lobby, heads turned, she recognized some of the faces, people who had once dismissed her as nothing more than Robert Valens' pretty but unimportant wife. Now they whispered about her for a different reason. She had built something on her own, something they wanted. She approached the receptionist, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor. Natalie Coleman, I have a meeting with Mr. Harrison. The woman gave her a professional smile. Of course. Mrs. Coleman, they're expecting you. As she was led through the sleek hallways, her confidence never wavered. But as she entered the conference room and saw who was sitting at the far end of the table, her breath hitched. Robert Valens. For a split second, she thought she was imagining things, but no. He was real, sitting there in a navy suit that looked slightly less tailored than the ones he used to wear. His hair was shorter, his face leaner, his once arrogant posture now more reserved. She hadn't seen him in 7 years. Her heart pounded, but she didn't let it show. She forced her expression to remain composed, her chin lifting slightly as she met his gaze. He was just another businessman now. Nothing more. Robert, however, looked as if he had just seen a ghost. His grip on the pen he was holding tightened, his jaw clenching. Natalie, he breathed, almost as if testing to see if saying her name would make her disappear. She gave him a curt nod before turning to the other men in the room. Gentlemen, I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me. Harrison, always the polished businessman, gestured to the seat directly across from Robert. Please, have a seat. She did, keeping her movements calm and controlled, even as she felt the weight of Robert's stare on her. We've been following your success for some time, Harrison began. Your consulting firm has become one of the most sought after in the market. We believe there's an opportunity for a mutually beneficial partnership. Natalie folded her hands on the table. I appreciate the interest, but before we discuss any potential deals, I'd like to know exactly what role Mr. Valens plays in your firm. The room tensed. Robert's mouth opened slightly as if to respond, but it was Harrison who spoke first. Robert recently joined us as a strategic advisor. Given his experience in the corporate world, we felt his insight could be valuable. Natalie almost laughed. Experience. Robert had lost everything. He had been kicked out of his own company, stripped of his power, and abandoned by the very people who once worshipped him. And now, here he was, sitting across from her, no longer the untouchable businessman, but a man trying to rebuild from the ashes. She turned to Robert, arching an eyebrow. Strategic advisor, that's quite the change from CEO. Robert exhaled slowly, finally regaining his composure. People change, Natalie. She tilted her head slightly. Do they? A tense silence settled over the room. Harrison cleared his throat. We're here to talk about business, not the past. We believe your expertise could complement Robert's insights. I don't work with liabilities, Natalie interrupted smoothly, her gaze never leaving Robert's. A flicker of something, anger, regret, something else, flashed in his eyes. But he didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice measured. Then consider this an opportunity, not a liability. She narrowed her eyes. Interesting choice of words, considering that's exactly what you once called me. The room went completely still. Even Harrison looked like he wanted to disappear. Robert inhaled sharply, but instead of the arrogant retort she half expected, he nodded. I deserve that. The acknowledgement caught her off guard, but she didn't let it show. She turned back to Harrison. I came here because I was under the impression this was an investment opportunity. If you want my expertise, I expect full control over my own projects. I don't take orders, and I don't answer to anyone. Harrison hesitated, then nodded. Understood. We can discuss the terms. She stood. Then let's schedule another meeting when the contract is ready for review. Robert rose as well. Natalie. She met his gaze, expression unreadable. He hesitated before speaking. Can we talk? Alone. The room seemed to shrink around them, but she didn't let herself waver. There's nothing to say. There's everything to say. He countered, his voice lower now, almost pleading. For a moment she considered walking out without another word, but then she remembered Elijah. She remembered the years she had spent struggling while Robert had lived his life without a care. Maybe it was time to face the past, if only to finally bury it. She nodded once. 5 minutes. Harrison and the others took that as their cue to leave, filing out of the room until it was just the two of them. The second they were alone, Robert exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. I didn't expect to see you here. That makes two of us, she said coolly. He studied her, as if trying to read her, but she gave him nothing. You've changed, he finally said. She smirked. So have you. Robert ran a hand through his hair, looking momentarily lost before his gaze hardened. I know I was a bastard to you, Natalie. I can't change what I did, but I need you to know that I regret it. Every single day. She crossed her arms. Regret doesn't erase the past. No, it doesn't, he admitted. But it's why I'm standing here now, trying to fix at least one thing in my life. She exhaled slowly. Fixing things. Is that why you want to talk, Robert? Or is it because you just realized I'm the one in power now? He shook his head. This isn't about power. It's about you and... He hesitated. And Elijah. Her heart skipped a beat. She should have known this moment would come. Robert stepped closer. He's my son, isn't he? Natalie's breath caught, but she quickly masked it. You don't get to ask that. His jaw tightened. I need to know. She looked at him. The man who had once shattered her, now standing before her with desperation in his eyes. For years, she had imagined this moment, and now that it was here, she had no idea what to say. Natalie felt her pulse hammering in her ears as she stared at Robert. The room around them seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in as his question hung in the air between them. He's my son, isn't he? She had always known this day would come, but she had imagined herself more prepared, more composed. And yet, standing here, facing the man who had once thrown her away like she was nothing, she found herself caught in the whirlwind of emotions she had buried for years. She took a slow breath, forcing herself to stay in control. Why do you care, Robert? Her voice was steady, but she could see the flicker of something in his eyes. Hurt, maybe, or regret. He swallowed, stepping closer, but she didn't move. Because I lost everything, Natalie. And for the first time in my life, I understand what that really means. She scoffed, crossing her arms. You lost your company, your wealth, your power, but you had a choice. I didn't. He exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. I know, he admitted. I know I don't deserve anything from you. I don't even deserve to ask. But if he's mine, I need to know. She studied him, searching for the man she had once loved, the man who had broken her beyond repair. He was different now, stripped of his arrogance. But did that mean he had changed? Or was this just another way for him to regain control? After a long silence, she answered, "Yes." The word was barely above a whisper, but it hit Robert like a tidal wave. He staggered back slightly, his hands gripping the edge of the conference table as if he needed to steady himself. His lips parted, but no words came out. "He's 7 years old," Natalie continued, her voice calm but firm. "He's smart, kind, and he doesn't know who you are." "Because I made sure of that." Robert inhaled deeply, his fingers curling into fists. "You never told me." She let out a humorless laugh. "Oh, now you care. You told me to disappear, Robert. You made it very clear that I was nothing to you. Why would I have given you the chance to do the same to him?" He flinched at her words, pain flashing in his eyes. "I was a fool," he admitted. "A selfish, blind fool, and if I could take it all back—" "But you can't," she cut in. "You can't erase the years I spent alone, struggling to raise a child while you lived your life without a second thought about me." His jaw tightened. "I thought about you every damn day." She shook her head, unwilling to believe his words. "You're too late, Robert. Elijah has a life, a good one, and I won't let you ruin that." He exhaled, his expression shifting into something almost desperate. "I don't want to ruin anything. I need to know him." A silence stretched between them, heavy and uncertain. Natalie felt her heart clench. Elijah deserved the truth, but did Robert deserve Elijah? "I don't trust you," she finally said. Robert nodded, as if he had expected that answer. "Then let me earn it." She frowned. "And how do you plan on doing that?" "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'll do whatever it takes." Natalie stared at him, her emotions at war. She had spent years keeping Elijah safe from the man standing in front of her, and now Robert was asking for a place in their lives. Could she really allow that? Finally, she sighed. "I need time." His shoulders relaxed slightly. "That's all I'm asking for." She turned toward the door, pausing before looking back. "But understand this, Robert. If you ever hurt him the way you hurt me, I will never forgive you." Robert held her gaze, and for the first time in his life, he truly looked afraid. "I won't," he promised. Natalie wasn't sure she believed him, but time would tell. Natalie sat in her car outside her apartment, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her conversation with Robert still echoed in her mind, replaying in an endless loop. She had expected anger, denial, maybe even some pathetic attempt to shift the blame. But not this, not regret, not the quiet desperation in his voice. "I need to know him," she exhaled, closing her eyes for a brief moment. Elijah was her world, the one thing she had done right after everything fell apart. And now, after all these years, Robert wanted a place in his life. Did she trust him? No, but Elijah had a right to the truth, no matter how much she wanted to protect him from the man who had once shattered her. She took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. The elevator ride to her floor felt endless, her thoughts racing. When she entered the apartment, she was greeted by the sound of cartoons playing in the living room. "Mom," Elijah called, looking up from his spot on the couch. His bright blue eyes, Robert's eyes, sparkled with excitement. "Did you bring me anything?" Natalie smiled, pushing aside her swirling emotions. "Just dinner, sweetheart." She held up a bag from his favorite takeout place, and he cheered, jumping up to help her set the table. As they ate, Natalie watched her son, memorizing every small detail of his face. He was so full of life, so happy. He didn't need to know how much she had struggled to give him this kind of childhood. He didn't need to know about the nights she had cried herself to sleep, wondering if she had made the right choice in keeping Robert away. But now, that choice wasn't just hers to make anymore. After dinner, as Elijah played with his toys, Natalie sat across from him on the floor. "Sweetheart," she began carefully, "can I ask you something?" Elijah looked up, curious. "What is it?" She hesitated. "Have you ever thought about your dad?" His little forehead scrunched in thought. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Like when we do family stuff at school and other kids talk about their dads. But I just tell them it's me and Mom, and that's cool too." Her heart clenched. "Do you ever wish you knew who he was?" Elijah shrugged. "I guess, but if he wanted to be here, wouldn't he already be?" The innocence of the question nearly broke her. How could she explain that Robert hadn't wanted to be there? But now he did. How could she make sense of something that even she struggled to understand? She took his small hands in hers. "There's something I need to tell you," she said gently. "Your dad." He didn't know about you before, but now he does. And he wants to meet you." Elijah's eyes widened. "For real?" She nodded, bracing herself for his reaction. To her surprise, he didn't seem upset. He just looked thoughtful. "So, is he a good guy?" Natalie swallowed hard. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "But if you want, you can meet him and decide for yourself." Elijah tilted his head. "Will you be there too?" "Of course," she said immediately. "I wouldn't let anything happen to you." He considered this for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, I want to meet him." Natalie felt her heart squeeze. She had given Elijah the choice, and now there was no turning back. Robert paced outside the cafe, hands stuffed into the pockets of his coat. His heart pounded, a foreign sensation of nerves twisting in his stomach. He had faced hostile boardrooms, cutthroat deals, and financial ruin, but nothing had ever terrified him more than this moment. Meeting his son, would Elijah hate him? Would he even care? Would he ask why his father had never been there? Robert didn't have the right answers. All he had was the overwhelming realization of how much he had lost, and the slim hope that he could still make things right. The sound of a car door closing made him turn, and then he saw them. Natalie walked toward him, poised and strong as ever, but it was the small boy beside her who stole Robert's breath away. "Elijah?" He looked up at Robert with the same blue eyes that stared back at him in the mirror every morning. His small hands were tucked into the pockets of his jacket, and there was curiosity in his gaze, but also caution. Robert's throat went dry. He had rehearsed a dozen things to say, but now, standing in front of his son for the first time, all of them vanished. Natalie knelt down beside Elijah, her voice gentle. "Sweetheart, this is Robert, your father." Elijah studied him for a long moment. Then, in the most casual voice, he asked, "Do you like dinosaurs?" Robert blinked. That was the first thing his son wanted to know. He let out a short laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. Yeah, I do." Elijah grinned. "Me too. What's your favorite?" Robert hesitated for only a second before answering. "Tyrannosaurus Rex." Elijah's eyes lit up. "Me too." Natalie watched the exchange in silence, her emotions unreadable. Robert took a slow breath. This wasn't going to be easy, and he had a long way to go before proving himself. But in that moment, as Elijah smiled up at him, he realized something. For the first time in years, he had hope. Robert sat across from Elijah at the cafe table, trying to steady his nerves. He had expected tension, maybe even hostility, but instead, he found himself in a conversation about dinosaurs. It was surreal. "So, you like the T-Rex too?" Elijah asked, his small hands wrapped around his cup of hot chocolate. Robert nodded, offering a small smile. "Yeah, it's strong, fast, and, well, kind of a king." Elijah's eyes widened. "But did you know the velociraptor was way smarter? Scientists say it was one of the most intelligent dinosaurs." Robert leaned forward, intrigued. "Really? I thought they were just fast." "Nope. Super smart, and they hunted in packs." Elijah grinned. "So I think I'd rather be a velociraptor than a T-Rex." Robert chuckled, shaking his head. "Smart and fast sounds like a good choice." Natalie watched the exchange in silence, her expression unreadable. This was what she had worried about. That Robert would walk in and charm Elijah with an easy conversation, making the boy feel comfortable, while she still held every doubt in her heart. After a few more minutes of discussion about prehistoric creatures, Elijah finally asked the question Natalie had been dreading. "So, where have you been?" Robert inhaled sharply, glancing at Natalie before turning back to his son. He had expected this question, but knowing it was coming didn't make answering it any easier. "I didn't know about you," he admitted, "and that's my fault." Elijah tilted his head. "Mom said you didn't want us." Natalie stiffened. It wasn't exactly how she had framed it, but she hadn't sugarcoated the truth either. Robert met Elijah's gaze, his voice steady but filled with regret. "I made a terrible mistake a long time ago. I hurt your mom, and because of that, I lost the chance to be with you. But if I could change the past, I would." Elijah stared at him, processing his words. "You didn't want a family before?" Robert hesitated. "I didn't know what I wanted back then. I thought work was the most important thing. I thought..." He swallowed hard. "I was wrong." Elijah studied him for a moment before nodding slowly. "Okay, that was it. No accusations, no further interrogation." Just okay. Robert exhaled, relieved but also shaken. Did Elijah really understand what he had just told him? Or was he just accepting things because he was still too young to grasp the weight of it all? Natalie sipped her coffee, watching Elijah closely. If there was one thing she had learned about her son, it was that he wasn't the type to rush to conclusions. He was listening, absorbing, and she knew he'd keep thinking about this long after they left the cafe. So, Elijah kicked his feet lightly under the table. What do we do now? Robert blinked. What do you mean? Are you going to be around? Natalie's stomach clenched at the question. Robert straightened. If you want me to be, then yes. Elijah glanced at his mother, as if gauging her reaction. Mom, Natalie exhaled. That's up to you, sweetheart. If you want to see him again, we can talk about it. Elijah nodded, seeming thoughtful. Okay, but not every day. I have school and stuff. Robert let out a small chuckle. I understand. And I don't like boring grown-up talks. If we hang out, we have to do fun stuff. Robert's lips quirked into a smirk. Fun stuff, huh? Like what? Elijah grinned. Like going to the dinosaur museum. They have a new exhibit and I really want to see it. Natalie opened her mouth to object, to tell Elijah that this was too much too soon. But Robert surprised her. He didn't jump at the opportunity, didn't immediately agree. Instead, he looked at her first. She realized with a strange sense of shock that he was waiting for her approval. She hesitated, torn between protecting her son and respecting his wishes. But she had promised Elijah that this would be his choice. Finally, she sighed. I'll think about it. Elijah pouted slightly but didn't argue. Robert looked relieved. That's fair. The three of them sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the moment settling in. This was new territory for all of them. Natalie didn't trust Robert yet, but for Elijah's sake, she was willing to take cautious steps forward. After finishing their drinks, Natalie checked the time. We should get going. Elijah hopped down from his chair, adjusting his jacket. Bye, Robert. Robert flinched slightly at hearing his name instead of Dad, but he didn't show it. He simply smiled. See you soon, buddy. Natalie hesitated before speaking. I'll call you about the museum. Robert nodded. I'd like that. As Natalie and Elijah walked away, Robert watched them until they disappeared around the corner. He had barely scratched the surface. But it was something, a first step. He only hoped he wouldn't mess it up. Natalie sat on her couch, legs crossed, her laptop open in front of her. The cursor blinked impatiently as she stared at the draft of an email she had been trying to write for the past 30 minutes. It wasn't a business proposal or a legal document. Those she could handle with ease. No, this was far more complicated. She was writing to Robert, the museum trip. Elijah hadn't stopped talking about it since their cafe meeting, excitement lacing his every word, and as much as she wanted to protect her son, she couldn't deny him the chance to make his own judgment. Robert was his father, whether she liked it or not, and Elijah, for all his youthful innocence, deserved to see that truth for himself. Still, the idea of sending this email, of setting up this meeting, felt like opening a door she had sworn never to touch again. With a deep breath, she typed out a simple message. Robert, Elijah is ready to go to the museum this Saturday. I'll bring him, but there are conditions. I'll be there the entire time. No gifts, no over-the-top gestures, just a simple day at the museum. If you're late or don't show, this is over. Let me know if you agree, Natalie. She hovered over the send button, her mind screaming at her to reconsider, but before she could overthink it, she clicked. It was done. The response came faster than she expected. Natalie, I understand, I'll be there. Thank you for this, Robert. She wasn't sure if it was relief or regret that settled in her chest. But either way, there was no turning back now. The museum was buzzing with families when they arrived on Saturday morning. Natalie held Elijah's hand as they made their way inside, her eyes scanning the crowd until she spotted Robert near the entrance. He was dressed casually, jeans, a fitted sweater, looking far different from the man she had once known. Always in tailored suits and polished shoes. When his gaze met hers, he gave a small nod, then looked down at Elijah. Hey, buddy. Elijah grinned. Did you know some dinosaurs had feathers? Robert blinked at the sudden question but quickly recovered. I did actually, but I bet you know more about it than I do. Elijah puffed out his chest. I totally do. Natalie stayed quiet, watching the exchange with wary curiosity. Robert wasn't forcing anything, He wasn't pushing for affection or demanding anything from Elijah. Instead, he was listening, engaging, and Elijah, despite his natural caution, was responding. They made their way through the exhibit. With Elijah enthusiastically explaining every fossil and display, Robert listened intently, asking questions and matching Elijah's energy without overstepping. Natalie kept her distance, observing. She had expected awkwardness, maybe even resistance from Elijah. But her son was naturally open-hearted, always willing to give people a chance. It was her who struggled with trust, with letting go of the past. At one point, Robert and Elijah stood in front of a massive Tyrannosaurus Rex skeleton. Elijah stared up in awe, while Robert kneeled beside him. "You know," Robert said, "when I was your age, I wanted to be a paleontologist." Elijah's eyes widened. "For real?" Robert chuckled. "Yeah, I thought digging up dinosaur bones would be the coolest job in the world." Elijah nudged him. "So what happened?" Robert hesitated, glancing at Natalie before answering. "I guess I got distracted by other things." Elijah frowned. "That's kind of sad." Robert let out a quiet breath. "Yeah, it is." Natalie watched as Robert ruffled Elijah's hair, a soft but genuine smile on his face. It was a small moment, but it felt significant. They spent hours in the museum, moving through exhibits and even sitting through a short educational film about the Jurassic era. Natalie remained on guard the entire time, ready to step in if Robert tried anything to overstep the boundaries she had set, but he didn't. When it was finally time to leave, they walked back toward the entrance together. Elijah ran a few steps ahead, still energized, while Natalie and Robert fell into step behind him. "I appreciate this," Robert said quietly. Natalie sighed. "I'm doing this for him." "I know." He paused. "But I'm still grateful." She glanced at him, searching his face for any hint of deception, but all she saw was sincerity. It unsettled her. Elijah ran back to them, practically bouncing. "This was awesome. Can we do it again sometime?" Natalie hesitated, her protective instincts kicking in, but before she could answer, Robert spoke. "That's up to your mom, buddy." Elijah turned his hopeful gaze to her. "Mom?" She let out a slow breath. "We'll see." Elijah groaned. "That means no." She smirked. "That means we'll see." Robert smiled, but didn't push. "Fair enough." As they reached the parking lot, Robert kneeled down in front of Elijah. "Hey, thanks for today. I had a lot of fun." Elijah grinned. "Me too." Then, without warning, he threw his arms around Robert in a quick hug before pulling away just as fast. "Bye?" Robert looked stunned, frozen in place as Elijah ran toward the car. Natalie saw the way his hands clenched at his sides, as if he was holding himself back from reacting too much. She met his gaze. "Don't read too much into it." He gave a small, sad smile. "I won't." But she knew that wasn't entirely true. As she drove away, glancing in the rearview mirror to see Robert standing there watching them, she couldn't shake the feeling that something irreversible had just shifted, and she wasn't sure if that terrified her or gave her hope. Natalie sat at the kitchen table, her laptop open, but the words on the screen blurred as her mind drifted back to the museum trip. It had been days since they went. Yet the memory of Robert and Elijah together lingered in her thoughts. The way Elijah had looked at his father with curiosity instead of resentment. The way Robert had restrained himself, not pushing too hard, not trying to claim a role he hadn't earned yet. She had expected the trip to be overwhelming, maybe even disastrous. Instead, it had been normal. That was what unsettled her the most. A soft thud brought her back to reality. Elijah had plopped down in the chair across from her, a coloring book in hand. His little legs swung beneath the table as he flipped through the pages, occasionally glancing up at her. "Mom?" he asked, not looking up from his book. "Yeah, sweetheart." "Robert, my dad, can I see him again?" Natalie's fingers tensed against the keyboard. She had known this question was coming, but she had hoped for more time to prepare. "Why do you want to see him again?" Elijah shrugged. "Coloring in a triceratops. I don't know, he's kind of cool. He listens when I talk about stuff and he knows a lot. And he doesn't treat me like a little kid." She exhaled slowly. "He listens." That was something Robert had never done with her. Could he truly be different now? Elijah looked up, his innocent eyes searching hers. "Do you not want me to?" "It's not that," she said carefully. "I just want to make sure you're safe and happy. This is new for both of us, and I need to make sure it's the right decision." He nodded, but she could see the gears turning in his mind. Can we do another fun thing next time? Natalie hesitated. You're that sure there's going to be a next time? Elijah grinned. I think you like him more than you pretend to. She laughed despite herself. You think so, huh? Uh-huh. He colored a little more before pausing. Did he ever make you sad? Her heart squeezed. How could she explain everything Robert had done without breaking the simple, safe world Elijah lived in? She placed a hand on her son's. A long time ago, yes, but people can change, and that's what we're trying to figure out. Elijah nodded thoughtfully. Then let's figure it out together. Natalie smiled softly, brushing his hair back. He was such a good kid, so much wiser than his years. He deserved the truth, but he also deserved to make his own choices. All right, she said finally. I'll talk to Robert. Elijah beamed. Robert answered on the second ring. Natalie, he said, a mixture of surprise and hope in his voice. Don't get excited, she warned. I'm calling because Elijah wants to see you again. A pause. Then, he wants to. She could almost picture the way his expression must have shifted. First disbelief, then cautious optimism. Yes, she admitted. And I told him I'd talk to you. There was silence on the other end before Robert finally spoke. Thank you. Natalie sighed, already regretting this conversation. He wants another outing, but I make the rules. No overstepping, no big gestures. Of course. I mean it, Robert, she pressed. If you start trying to play the hero or win him over with gifts, I'll cut this off immediately. His voice was quieter this time. I just want time with him, Natalie. That's all. Something about the sincerity in his tone unsettled her more than any manipulation ever could. After a long pause, she said, Fine, we'll go to the park this weekend, just a simple day. She heard the relief in his exhale. I'll be there. She hung up before the conversation could linger. Saturday arrived with a crisp autumn breeze sweeping through the park. The golden leaves crunched beneath their feet as Natalie and Elijah walked toward the open field where Robert was already waiting. He stood near a bench, hands in his pockets, looking more at ease than she had ever seen him. Elijah wasted no time. You made it, he called out as he ran ahead. Robert smiled, kneeling down. Of course I wouldn't miss it. Natalie approached slowly, observing as Elijah launched into an excited explanation of his latest school project. Robert listened attentively, nodding along, asking questions. She sat on the bench, arms crossed, watching them. She had seen Robert command entire rooms, dictate billion-dollar deals, and destroy careers without blinking. But here, kneeling in the grass, listening to a 7-year-old talk about volcanoes, he was different. They spent the afternoon playing soccer, climbing the jungle gym, and even attempting to fly a kite. Though Robert was embarrassingly bad at it, Elijah laughed harder than she had heard in a long time. And to her surprise, so did she. As the sun started to dip lower, Robert and Elijah sat on the swings, their conversation softer now. Are you going to be around for a long time? Elijah asked suddenly. Robert's grip tightened on the chains. I want to be. Elijah kicked at the dirt beneath him. Good. Natalie's chest tightened. This was happening. This was real. As they walked back to the car, Elijah turned to Robert. Can we do this again? Robert glanced at Natalie. She nodded just once. A slow smile spread across his face. I'd love that. Elijah grinned. Cool. Natalie still didn't trust Robert completely, but as she watched him ruffle Elijah's hair with genuine affection, she realized something. Neither did Robert trust himself yet. Maybe that was the difference. Maybe that was why, against all odds, she was starting to believe that this time, things could be different. The cool evening air drifted through Natalie's open kitchen window as she prepared dinner, the rhythmic chopping of vegetables grounding her restless thoughts. It had been weeks since Robert re-entered their lives, and despite her initial fears, he had yet to give her a reason to shut him out completely. He was careful, too careful, almost, as if he knew just how thin the ice beneath him was. Elijah had warmed up to him faster than she expected, though not recklessly. He was curious, fascinated by this man who had suddenly become a part of his world. But he wasn't naive. He asked questions, always testing, always observing. And Natalie, she hated to admit it, but she was observing too, watching Robert with the same scrutiny she had honed in the years of rebuilding her life. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She wiped her hands on a towel and went to open it, surprised to see Walter standing there, his expression thoughtful. "Hey," she said, stepping aside. "You look like you have something on your mind." Walter chuckled, stepping inside. "You always could read me too well." Natalie poured him a cup of coffee as he settled into one of the kitchen chairs. "Something happened?" she asked. He took a sip, exhaling slowly. "Not exactly, but I saw your ex today." She stiffened. "Robert?" Walter nodded. "He was at a coffee shop downtown, alone, looked different." Natalie frowned. "Different how?" "Like a man trying to figure out who he is." Walter leaned forward. "You know I never liked him, but I also know people change. If they want to." She sighed, rubbing her temples. "I don't know what to do with that, Walter." He gave her a knowing look. "You're waiting for him to screw up." She flinched at the truth in his words. Walter continued, "But what if he doesn't?" Natalie shook her head. "I can't afford to let my guard down." "I get it," Walter said. "But don't let your past with him blind you to the present. Elijah sees something in him. Maybe you should too." Later that night, after putting Elijah to bed, Natalie sat in her living room, the silence pressing in around her. Her laptop was open, but she wasn't working. Instead, she was staring at an email she had received earlier that day. It was from Harrison and Monroe. The deal she had negotiated with them was finalized. It was the kind of partnership that could elevate her company to the next level. She should have felt triumphant, but the lingering fact that Robert worked for them gnawed at her. She hadn't asked him about it, hadn't let herself wonder what his role in all of this truly was. But the more he became involved in Elijah's life, the harder it was to ignore. Before she could talk herself out of it, she picked up her phone and dialed. Robert answered on the second ring. "Natalie," she hesitated. "Are you busy?" A pause. "No. What's going on?" she inhaled. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest." "Okay." She gripped the phone tighter. "Why did you take a job with Harrison and Monroe?" There was a long silence. "I didn't have many choices," Robert finally admitted. "After I lost everything, no one wanted to hire me." No one wanted to take a risk on the man who once ruled the business world and then crashed harder than anyone expected. Natalie bit her lip. "So, they were your only option?" "At first, yes, but now, I'm trying to make something of it," she exhaled. "And does this have anything to do with me?" Another pause. "At first, no, but when I found out you were working with them..." He hesitated. "It felt like fate." Natalie let out a short laugh. "Fate. I know how it sounds," he admitted, "but I'm not here to interfere with your success. You earned everything you have, His voice dropped. "I wanted to be close." Even if it was just through a business deal. Natalie closed her eyes, her emotions tangled. "I don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything," Robert said softly. "Just know that I'm trying. Not just for Elijah, for myself too." She didn't respond immediately after a long pause. She finally said, "Good night, Robert." "Good night, Natalie." She hung up and sat back, staring at the ceiling. She wasn't ready to believe in him, but for the first time, she wasn't completely convinced she shouldn't. Natalie arrived at her office early, hoping the quiet of the morning would help clear her mind. It didn't. No matter how much she tried to bury herself in work, her thoughts kept circling back to the conversation with Robert. She had spent years building her life around one fundamental belief, that Robert Valens was nothing but a selfish, arrogant man who had thrown her away. That belief had fueled her determination, kept her focused, and ensured she never made the mistake of relying on anyone else again. But now he was different, or at least he was trying to be, and that terrified her. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she called. The door opened, and Walter stepped inside, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Figured you'd need this." Natalie offered a grateful smile. "You know me too well." Walter sat across from her, sliding one of the cups her way. "You look like someone who spent the night thinking too much." She let out a breathy laugh. "That obvious?" Painfully. He took a sip of his coffee before leveling her with a look. "So, what's going on?" Natalie hesitated. "It's Robert." Walter raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for her to continue. "Elijah wants to see him more, and I don't know what to do with that," she admitted. I told myself I'd give Robert a chance, but I also told myself I'd keep my guard up. But every time I see them together, every time I see how much effort Robert is putting in, I feel conflicted. Walter finished. She exhaled. Yeah. Walter studied her for a moment before leaning forward. You're waiting for him to prove you right. Natalie frowned. What do you mean? You're waiting for him to fail, Walter said gently. Because if he does, it means you were right all along. It means you never have to question whether you should have given him another chance. She opened her mouth to argue but closed it again, because he was right. She was waiting for Robert to mess up, because if he didn't, then what did that mean? That she had been wrong about him, that she had wasted years believing he was irredeemable when, in reality, he had the capacity to change. The thought unsettled her more than anything else. Walter leaned back. You don't have to trust him, Nat. But maybe, just maybe, you should trust Elijah. That evening, Natalie sat on the couch as Elijah flipped through a book beside her, his feet tucked under a blanket. The apartment was warm, cozy, filled with the soft hum of the city outside. Hey, buddy, she said, nudging him gently. Elijah looked up. Yeah, what do you think of Robert? His little forehead scrunched as he thought about it. I like him, he listens to me, and he doesn't act like I'm dumb. Natalie smiled softly. That's good. Elijah hesitated, then added, he looks kinda sad sometimes, though. That caught her off guard. Sad? Yeah, Elijah shrugged. Like when I talk about school or my favorite stuff. It's like he's happy but also sad. Natalie pressed her lips together. She had noticed it too. Robert was present, engaged, but there was a weight to him, a deep regret that never seemed to leave his eyes. Do you think he's a good person? She asked carefully. Elijah thought for a long moment. I think he's trying to be. Natalie felt something tighten in her chest. A week later, Robert met them at a small diner for dinner. Elijah's idea. The boy had insisted they eat burgers and milkshakes like a normal family. And despite Natalie's initial hesitation, she had agreed. Robert arrived on time, dressed casually, looking more relaxed than she had ever seen him. He greeted Elijah with a smile, but there was still that trace of sadness in his eyes. They ordered their food, and Elijah immediately launched into an animated retelling of his school day. Robert listened intently, nodding along and asking questions. Natalie observed quietly, taking in every detail. At one point, Robert glanced at her. You've done a great job with him. She blinked, caught off guard. He's smart, confident, Robert continued. That's because of you. Natalie hesitated before answering. I did what I had to do. I know, Robert said quietly, and I'll always regret that you had to do it alone. She looked away. Stirring her milkshake absently, she wasn't ready for this conversation. Not yet, Elijah, oblivious to the tension, grinned. Can we do this again next week? Natalie's first instinct was to say no, to slow things down. But when she looked at Elijah, she saw something she hadn't seen in a long time. Happiness. And so, against everything she had told herself, she nodded. We'll see, Elijah cheered. And Robert, for the first time that evening, truly smiled. Natalie stood in the doorway of Elijah's bedroom, watching as he slept, his tiny chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The soft glow of the nightlight bathed the room in a warm hue, casting long shadows along the walls. His dinosaur books were piled on the nightstand, his favorite stuffed raptor tucked under one arm. He looked peaceful, safe. She exhaled, stepping back and closing the door gently. Her mind was restless, her thoughts tangled. The dinner with Robert had gone smoothly, almost too smoothly. She had seen a side of him she had never expected to see again, a version of him she wasn't sure she had ever known at all. It would have been easier if he had remained the same arrogant man who had walked away from her all those years ago. But he wasn't, and that complicated everything. She poured herself a glass of wine and sat by the window. The city lights twinkling below. When her phone buzzed, she didn't have to check the screen to know who it was. Robert, I just wanted to say thanks. For today, it meant a lot. She hesitated before responding. Natalie? Elijah had fun. That's what matters. A moment passed, then another. Robert, it matters to me, too. She stared at the screen for a long time before setting the phone aside. The next afternoon, Natalie was in the middle of a conference call when her office phone rang. She ignored it at first, but when her assistant knocked and peeked in with a concerned expression, she frowned. It's Robert. her assistant whispered. He says it's urgent. Natalie's stomach tightened. She quickly wrapped up the call and picked up the receiver. Robert, what's wrong? His voice was strained. It's about Elijah. She was on her feet instantly, her heart pounding. Is he okay? Yes, he's fine, Robert assured her quickly. But something happened at school. Natalie grabbed her coat. Where are you? I'm already here. I got a call from his teacher and I came straight over. Natalie barely remembered the drive to Elijah's school. By the time she arrived, she spotted Robert outside the front office, his hands in his pockets, his jaw tight. What happened? She demanded. Robert exhaled. Some kid was teasing him about not having a dad. Natalie's stomach dropped. What? Elijah got upset. There was a bit of a fight, Robert admitted. She closed her eyes briefly, then marched inside, Robert following closely behind. Inside the principal's office, Elijah sat in a chair, arms crossed. Looking defiant, his teacher, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, sighed. He didn't start the fight, but he did push back. Natalie kneeled beside her son. Elijah, sweetheart, what happened? Elijah huffed. Ryan said my dad left because he didn't want me, so I told him he was stupid. Robert crouched beside him. And then, Elijah bit his lip. Then I might have pushed him. Natalie sighed, rubbing his back. Sweetheart, you know violence isn't the answer. I know, Elijah mumbled, but it wasn't fair. Robert met Natalie's gaze before turning back to their son. Listen to me, buddy. People are going to say things. Sometimes things that aren't true, but fighting won't change that. Elijah frowned. Then what am I supposed to do? Robert hesitated. Then gently he said, You show them they're wrong by living your truth. Elijah studied him carefully. So, you did want me? Robert swallowed hard, his expression raw. More than anything, the principal stepped in, offering a small smile. Elijah's not in serious trouble. We just wanted to make sure you were aware of what happened. Natalie exhaled in relief. Thank you. As they walked out of the building, Elijah held Natalie's hand while glancing up at Robert. So what now? Natalie squeezed his hand. Now, we go home. Robert hesitated, then crouched to Elijah's level. Would it be okay if I walked with you? Elijah considered it before nodding. Yeah, that'd be okay. Natalie didn't say anything, but as she watched Robert fall into step beside them, something inside her shifted. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't a ghost from her past anymore. Maybe he was becoming something more. The evening air was cool as Natalie, Elijah, and Robert walked through the quiet streets toward her apartment. The tension from earlier at the school had eased, but the weight of the conversation still lingered. Elijah skipped a few steps ahead, humming to himself, seemingly unbothered by what had happened. Natalie envied his resilience. Robert, walking beside her, kept glancing over at Elijah, as if trying to memorize every detail of the boy he had missed for 7 years. Natalie noticed the subtle change in him. He was more present, more careful with his words. The arrogance she had once despised had been replaced with something else: regret. They reached the apartment building, and Elijah turned to them. Can Robert stay for dinner? Natalie stiffened. She wasn't ready for this. Letting him spend time with Elijah was one thing, but letting him into her home, into the safe space she had built, that was another. Robert seemed to sense her hesitation. Only if it's okay with your mom, buddy. Elijah gave her his best pleading look, his blue eyes, Robert's eyes, wide with hope. She sighed. Fine, but no junk food. Elijah grinned. Yes. He ran inside, leaving them alone in the entryway. Robert looked at her cautiously. Are you sure? No, she admitted. But I'm doing this for him. Robert nodded. That's enough for me. Dinner was unexpectedly normal. Natalie cooked while Robert and Elijah set the table. They talked about everything from school to Elijah's favorite TV shows. And for the first time, the atmosphere felt less like strangers trying to navigate the past and more like something natural. At one point, Robert got up to grab a glass from the cupboard. You remember where I keep them? Natalie asked, surprised. He hesitated, giving her a small smile. Some things don't change. She didn't know how to respond to that, so she focused on serving the food instead. Throughout dinner, Elijah kept pulling Robert into conversation, asking questions about his life, his job, even his favorite childhood memories. Did you ever get into trouble at school? Elijah asked, grinning. Robert chuckled. Once or twice, Natalie scoffed. Once or twice you were a nightmare in high school, Robert laughed. Okay, maybe more than twice. Elijah leaned forward. Like what? Robert glanced at Natalie before answering. Let's just say, I wasn't the best at following rules. Elijah's eyes widened with amusement. Mom always says rules are important, Robert smirked. Your mom was always the responsible one. Natalie shook her head but couldn't hide her smile. One of us had to be. For a moment, there was a flicker of something between them. Familiarity, shared history. Then Elijah yawned, rubbing his eyes. All right, kiddo, Natalie said, standing up. Time for bed. Elijah groaned but didn't argue. He looked at Robert. Will I see you again soon? Robert glanced at Natalie, waiting for her approval. She hesitated before nodding. Yeah, buddy, Robert said softly. I'll see you soon. Elijah grinned. Cool. He ran off to brush his teeth, leaving them alone. Robert exhaled. Thank you. Natalie crossed her arms. Don't thank me yet. He met her gaze. I meant it, about regretting everything. She looked away. Robert, I know I don't deserve anything from you, he said quietly. But I want to be the father Elijah deserves. I just hope, one day, you can trust that. Natalie studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, she said, Good night, Robert. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something, and for now, that was enough. The next few weeks passed in a blur, and to Natalie's surprise, Robert remained consistent. He didn't push boundaries. He didn't try to overcompensate for the years he had missed. Instead, he showed up, every time. He met Elijah for ice cream after school. He took him to the bookstore to pick out new dinosaur encyclopedias. He attended his soccer games, standing quietly on the sidelines, clapping after every goal, whether Elijah scored or not. And through it all, Natalie watched. She had spent so many years believing Robert was incapable of change, that the man who had once humiliated and discarded her would never be anything but selfish. But now, as she observed him with Elijah, saw the patience in his voice, the gentleness in his actions, she had to admit she had been wrong. The realization unsettled her. One evening after Elijah had gone to bed, Natalie found herself sitting on her balcony, wrapped in a soft blanket, staring at the city skyline. The weight of everything was pressing down on her. A part of her still wanted to keep Robert at arm's length. It was safer that way. But another part, the part that had spent years raising their son alone, felt exhausted. She was tired of fighting the past. Her phone buzzed on the small table beside her. She didn't need to check to know who it was. Robert? She hesitated, then answered. Hey, he said, his voice warm. Elijah called me earlier. Said he wants to do a family game night. Natalie exhaled, smiling despite herself. He did he? Yeah, Robert chuckled. He was pretty insistent that I ask you. She rolled her eyes playfully. Of course he was. A beat of silence passed. Then Robert said, Look, I know this hasn't been easy for you. And I know I don't deserve how patient you've been. But I just want to say, thank you. Natalie swallowed. For what? For giving me the chance to be here, he said softly. For letting me be part of his life. Her grip tightened around the phone. After a long pause, she finally said, I didn't do it for you. Robert, I know. Another silence stretched between them. But this one felt different, lighter. Natalie closed her eyes. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop looking back. Tell Elijah we'll do game night on Friday, she murmured. Robert's smile was evident in his voice. I will. For the first time in years, the past didn't feel like a weight on her shoulders. For the first time, the future felt like something she could step into, without fear, and maybe, just maybe, they weren't just fixing what was broken. Maybe they were building something new.